It was early spring 2016. I had just turned 24 years old. My friend and I just reached our main spot to camp, Black Canyon Rim Campgrounds, just outside of Payson, Arizona. We'd usually travel out here 2 or 3 times each year. It has some incredible views and is only a couple hours away from the city. For the most part, this area was pretty secluded. A privately owned convenience store rested a few miles away, with a small town 20 miles before that. The entrance was on a dirt road, directly off the highway, with a campground sign at the start of the road, marking local wildlife, any fire hazards, and general news relevant to camping folk. The pathing is mostly linear, with maybe one fork spanning several miles. We once traveled down the dirt road to see how far it would take us. One of the paths would take you to another highway entrance, with a ranger's tower halfway there. The other path led to a dead end. An abandoned cabin can be found on this path, a few miles in, mostly hidden off in the distance behind some larger foliage. The snow had mostly cleared up at this point, leaving for a crisp air, a slight chill, and fauna becoming active again. We'd usually spot some wild horses, several deer, and tons of little critters whenever we'd come out this way. It really was the perfect time of year for a relaxing trip to get away from the city for a few days. We got in around 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was late for us, as we'd usually try to make it out there by noon at the latest. The trip was pretty spontaneous. We both had work during the coming weekend, and decided to just go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't picked our spot to camp. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families, parked somewhere close to the entrance, only a few hundred yards away from the highway. This time around, we just wanted to get away from humans for a while. Customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove down the dirt road, past our usual spot, and finally picked the perfect area. A small clearing, just hanging off the edge of a hill. The whole valley could be seen from this area, with a beautiful sunset. This would have been our main spot from then on, if the next night's incident never happened, that is. We agreed to get a campfire going, and would just avoid building a tent this trip. We didn't have much time to do that anyways, and her car wasn't that uncomfortable. I'd sleep in the back seat, and she'd take the passenger seat, with the windows slightly ajar. We'd have a few blankets for each of us, and would fall into that unrivaled slumber. The next day went fairly uneventful. We just decompressed. I had this strange feeling throughout the day, though, like we were being watched. There were crunching of leaves just out of sight every few hours, but I figured it was just the local wildlife doing their thing. My friend didn't notice anything unusual, so I didn't dwell on it. Night came, and the feeling still hadn't gone away. My friend must have felt something she didn't vocalize, though. She took some of her sleeping pills. She didn't usually need to take them on our camping trips. The nature's ambience was enough to put anyone to sleep, I thought. It was near 1 a.m. My friend dozed off in the passenger seat, while I attempted to wind down in the back. I leaned against the side window, behind the passenger seat, legs outstretched to the car's back door. The window opposite of me was rolled down slightly, with a cold breeze flowing in. I had been on my phone scrolling through Facebook or whatever, when I heard something outside. A few crunches of the fallen leaves, several paces outside the car. I whispered to my friend, "Did you hear that?" But she was already out. I put my phone down and listened intently for a minute or two. Nothing else followed. It must have been a small animal, curious of the camp. I went back to my phone, scrolling through social media. About 10 minutes had passed when I heard it again. Crunch. Right outside the door. I lowered the phone. My eyes took a moment to adjust from the light of the phone into the deep dark of the woods. As I turned the phone away from me, the backlight illuminated the window above my feet. To this day, I can't get the image out of my head. 2 dirty, scabbed hands held onto the window. the fingers wrapped inside the car. The nails were long, unkempt, and dark. Behind the window, a silhouette of a face was pressed up against it. The breath would create condensation every few seconds. All I could make out were the reflections of those empty, black eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like eternity. The staring contest between me and this thing. Thoughts were repeating incessantly in my head. Why haven't they ran away when they saw I noticed them? What were they planning? Is this the face of death? After probably 10 seconds of not doing anything, the hand slowly unclinched the window and receded into the darkness. The condensation on the window dispersed. Another couple seconds passed before I heard the dreaded crunch, 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 melodically fading into the distance. I still just sat there. What in the hell just happened? Why didn't I do anything? Why am I still not doing anything? With that thought, my body shot into adrenaline. I pounded on my friend's seat, waking her up from her slumber into a dizzy confusion. I unlatched and kicked open the back door, and took a moment to scan the area. Whoever they were, whatever it was gone. I scrambled to pick up any important camping supplies we left outside, and just crammed everything into the back seat and trunk, periodically looking over my shoulder, listening for those footsteps. I slammed the back door shut, and there they were, a grim reminder of that horror that just happened. 2 handprints imprinted on the window. I quickly wiped them off the window in a panic, a reaction to erase the events, I guess. I jumped into the front seat, started the car, and floored it out of there. My friend, finally coming to, asked me what the hell I'm doing. "We gotta go," I said. "There's someone out there." I didn't see whatever or whoever it was while fleeing the scene. Speeding down the dirt road, my friend insisted I slow down, and I eventually did. We reached the highway, and I proceeded to drive 20 or so miles before we reached a Denny's, where my friend asked for us to stop to eat and explain everything. The nightmare subsided a few months later. My embarrassment continues to this day, for the state of shock I was in at the time. Everybody says you either have a fight or flight instinct, and I'm confused whether I have either. I mean, I just sat there and did nothing. I frequently tend to ask myself who was out there. Another camper messing around with us? A resident of the abandoned cabin down the dirt road? Or maybe something more paranormal residing in the forest, watching lone, vulnerable campers as they drift off to dreamland. We'd still go camping there in the years ahead, but never too far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope that was the last I've seen of it. I, 23-year-old female, took my 2 dogs, a Cane Corso and a Labradoodle, on a walk on a nature trail near my home. My car was the only car parked in the parking lot when I arrived, so no one else was on the trail. The trailhead only has one entrance, and the trail has thick forest on either sides of it. My dogs and I started walking, and maybe 3/4 of a mile in, a man on a bike approached me from behind. I moved to the side with my dogs to let him pass me, and when he does, my Cane Corso lunged toward him. I held her back, but that was unusual behavior for her. Around 5 minutes after the biker passed me, he passed me again, going the other way toward the exit, and again my dog lunged at him. I thought it was extremely odd that he decided to turn around so quickly, since he couldn't have gone much more than a mile, which seems like an extremely short bike ride. He was dressed in biking gear and had a professional bike. It just seemed like he turned around very quickly after he saw me. I decided to stop and let my dogs rest. I FaceTimed my boyfriend to tell him about my odd encounter. My boyfriend agreed to stay on the phone with me while I walked back because I felt unsafe. Then, my dogs and I turned around and started heading back to my car. About half a mile into our trip back, both of my dogs lunged at something inside the tree line off to the side of the trail. They barked and growled and tugged on their leashes towards the area of the tree line. I did not see anything there, but my dogs definitely sensed something. We moved on and made it to the parking lot, and I saw one other car there with the man's bike hanging on the bike rack on the trunk of the vehicle. Once I got closer to the car, I realized no one was inside. I have a bad feeling that man had very bad intentions. I think that he biked back to his car after seeing me, walked to that spot on the trail and hid in the woods to do who knows what, then had second thoughts because I was on the phone with my boyfriend and I had 2 big dogs with me. It makes me sick to think about it. I'm open to other explanations if anyone can think of one. I want this to just be an innocent encounter, just a misunderstanding on my part, but it feels sinister, and I feel like my dog sensed his energy from the start. This situation made me realize that walking alone on a rural trail, even with 2 big dogs, is not safe for me. Just as a side note, him using the restroom in the forest is unlikely. There's a bathroom in the parking area. When I saw his car parked next to mine, I originally went to the bathroom area because I was worried he might be in his car or by his car. When I eventually went to my car to leave, that's when I realized no one was in his car. I've spent my life in Georgia and love hiking all over, but I must admit, North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there and hike and camp. This time, I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain Trailhead, and I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I'd never camped alone before. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous. Not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of up and downs and feeling like it wouldn't end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up while I still had light, so I stopped about a half-mile short of the summit and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon would be. I have trouble sleeping and usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to sleep. During this, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull the big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning, I woke up and ate oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with green cord propped up against my tent. Internally, I was pissing myself, but I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes, and no way I bothered to get to the summit. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended, and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorientate myself and found the trail again, one of the biggest reliefs. I made it out with no other incident. However, come to find out the same morning, a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me, and it's possible I would have run into him had I not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him, but I'll see if I can find something. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no clue about them. I recently returned from the worst trip I have ever been on, and I'm worried about the long-term fears. I'm an experienced solo hiker and camper. I am a 26-year-old female that has been outdoors my entire life. Growing up in a national forest, I started solo camping about 8 years ago. I travel in the US to explore new areas or return back to my favorites. I recently returned back to a national park closer to home, but stayed in a new area. I brought along my dog that has been on all my trips the past 3 years, and I also brought my puppy, with this being his first longer trip away from home. I did decide to do it a bit different and stay in the same spot the entire trip, so the puppy could gain some confidence for future trips. I arrived at my site a bit later in the evening, so I didn't have much time to walk around and check everything out. I set up camp, ate some food, and called it a night. It was around 45 degrees Fahrenheit this night. My spoiled dog likes to sleep on top of my legs with his blanket over him to stay extra warm. It was around 2:30 a.m. when he woke me up by jumping up. It was dead silent, something I've never really experienced before. There was not a single sound, so I waited. I started to hear some leaves crunching from a distance. They slowly got closer and he growled. I was assuming at this point whatever it was would turn around and go back, but it didn't. It never hesitated or stumbled as it continued to walk closer to my camp. I usually tell him to lay back down, but it not stopping or slowing down with a large dog growling at it threw me off, so I let him bark. It still never skipped a beat, but it was just getting closer. Eventually, it reached my tent, and with my 60-pound dog and 30-pound puppy barking, it circled our tent. It circled our tent without ever changing speed or making a single sound for what felt like hours, but ended up being less than 20 minutes. It then moved on to walk around the camp for about an hour. Not a single sound beside the leaves. No breathing, no huffs, no grunts, no knocking over anything, nothing. Just walking. In my head, I was trying to figure out how to get me and my dogs away from whatever animal this was if it wouldn't leave. Around 4 a.m. it left. It walked away and I didn't hear it again. I stayed awake mainly from fear over what had just happened and concern it would come back. Around 6:30 it was light enough outside to see without needing a light, so I got up, got my dogs in the car and left. I didn't have a plan besides getting away from there. I drove about 7 miles to reach another road and drove about 3 miles along the river before I felt like I could breathe again. I pulled over on the side of the road in a small parking lot and let the dogs eat and grabbed a granola bar. I waited there for a while with the night playing on repeat in my head. I have never experienced anything like that. I've experienced animals coming in my camp. I've experienced running into animals on a trail, and that was not the same. Bears grunt and run away. Coyotes are jumpy. Small animals usually run away fast as possible. I didn't cook anything in my camp, and my food was double-bagged inside my car. My trash was double-bagged inside a dry bag and in my car. I didn't have anything to offer to whatever it was, so I don't know why it wouldn't leave. It didn't feel the same as any other time I've had wildlife come into my camp. It didn't make me feel the same. I have never been so scared. I have never seen my dog so scared. I was a bit in shock and was trying to process everything, so I got back in my car so my dogs could rest, and I could just think. It was about 8 a.m. when I finally was able to call my mom and tell her everything. I needed to just say everything out loud and hear someone else's thoughts. While talking to her, I told her I didn't feel comfortable there, and I wasn't sure what to do. Surely it wouldn't return again, right? I was supposed to be there for 9 nights, and it was going to be my last trip away for a year. She told me to just go chill for a couple of hours and then decide what I wanted to do. So I did. I found a trail on the North Carolina-Tennessee border and was gone for about 2 hours. The anxiety I had on the trail was something new to me. I was so uncomfortable about being out there I had to turn around. I decided then I was going to pack up. It wasn't worth this feeling to stay out there. The main point of the trip was to help the puppy build confidence, and with me being nervous, it wasn't helping him any. I headed back to my camp and started packing. It's only about 1 p.m., so I'm taking my time, plenty of daylight left. I take my rain fly off my tent and start packing my sleeping pad and sleeping bag. That's when both dogs are looking to the left of me and growling. There's a road right behind a few trees that direction, so I assume they see someone or a car. I'm nervous, and I know they have been on high alert because of it, so I tell them to relax. Usually that means mind your business and lay down, but they didn't. I look over and see it. There's a mask hanging about 6 feet in a tree right next to our picnic table. My entire body freezes and I could feel myself go cold. I sat there for about 5 minutes just staring at it. Then I replay the night thinking, it wasn't acting like an animal because it wasn't an animal. The fear in that moment was 10 times worse than the previous night. I stopped packing and started grabbing my stuff. I threw everything in my car and got out. I was in a small campground. Sites were spread out, but close enough to see each other. I tried to find the host to tell them, but failed. I called several times for the next few days and never talked to anyone. I'm still trying. I left and called my mom, told her what had happened and that I was driving home. I got home around 8 p.m. and I was exhausted. I had been up since 2:30 a.m. when my dog woke me up to the sounds, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I laid down ready to sleep and passed out easily. That's when my new issues started. I'd jump awake at any sound. Following night was the same with nightmares, and again it's Monday morning and I haven't had real sleep in days. I decided to take my dog down to the road, to the state park, so we could both have a positive experience outside and hopefully move past this. We stayed in a clearing right off the road and walked around and played with the ball. This is when a small group walked by. My dog was fine. He kept doing his thing. They passed and a man followed not far behind. He stood in a parking lot across a small creek and half watched us, half walked around the parking area. My dog freaked out. He barked a few times, and when the man didn't do anything, he started whining. I tried to calm him down, but he wanted no part of it. I put him in the car and we left. This week, almost every night, I have growing fears. I close all my blinds before the sun goes down. I check to make sure doors and windows are locked. I refuse to go outside after dark. I let my dogs out and close the door and look down at the floor until the door is closed when I let them in. My entire life is being in nature. I grew up camping and hiking with family and found a deep love for doing it alone now. I'm worried this has changed me too much and I won't completely bounce back from it. I know it's only been a week, but with my fears growing, I just need advice. Is there anything I can do to help myself and my dog move on? Has anyone else experienced something like this? Anything that will help me. I need it. Figured I'd post the most unnerving, messed up thing that's happened to me in the woods, and the only incident where I was fully aware and believed my life was in danger. It happened in southern Kentucky in Wayne County. Specifically, what I was told was Edwards Mountain. This happened in the fall, and I was around 19 at the time. My friend that I mentioned in 2 previous posts, Kay, showed me this mountain range kind of location where a cave was. We had started to get heavy into caving, and if you know anything about the area, feel free to look it up. The entire county is riddled with cave systems, ridiculously so. We used to keep a map of all the ones we found and we could feasibly get to. I don't mind revealing locations, but if you get injured or shot, that's on you. Not much you can do to be disrespectful of the area, which you should be respectful and do it safely. But most county people dig the hell out of them or use them as trash dumps anyways. Some of the caves I know of are very dangerous, and it's a miracle none of us were ever harmed. Also, there are toxic caves. This cave was kind of odd. It was a large cavern, but part of me hesitates to even call it a cave, because it was kind of like a cliff overhang as well, but you could definitely walk inside to a central chamber that was bigger than most apartments, and there was a tunnel you could exit on the left-hand back area if you shimmy squeezed yourself through. It's not far off from the road in the least. It's on a back county road, and then there's a small gravel road you turn off on. This road goes into the woods and banks up and left, and it keeps going. I've never seen what's at the end of it. Generally, you park on the bend and the mouth is up an embankment. I've been there twice before with Kay, and never ran into other people, and never saw anything of note. We never really thoroughly explored the area either, which I wanted to do. I wanted to hike along the ridge to see if there were any other entrances. He was never interested because he thought the place was boring and had been there multiple times before, since it was essentially in his neck of the woods. So another friend and I are hanging out, Jay, and I've managed to get him onto the caving adventure hype train. So I suggest we go check this place out and walk along the ridge. We take his car. He brings his handgun. Jay was 23 at the time. We take his car and get to the gravel road, and as we're coming in, a small pickup truck is coming out. An older, haggy-looking woman is driving. Jay was driving a small car, so we couldn't go too far off the road lest we get stuck. She wouldn't budge and let us around. Jay starts to get aggravated and cussing to himself, and she just mean mugs us. After a few minutes, she finally yields and pulls to the side enough to let us pass. At this point, I would like to note that as far as I knew, no one lived back there. At least, I was never told anyone did, and there were no signs of any kind posted about private property. The gravel road has no name. As far as we were concerned and knew people came up here often, that it was perfectly fine to be there. Jay and I park the car in the bend and get out. We check out the main chamber where there's an old fire, and start to walk around the ridge on the left-hand side. 3 things of note. We find a sifter, not unusual. People dig for arrowheads and pottery in this county all the time. I smell the distinctly ghastly smell of bone marrow. I assume there's a dead animal, but I can't find any carcass, and the smell is strong. I figure since vultures are very common and nest in the cliffy areas, there must be a nest somewhere with a carcass in it. We find a rope anchored on an extremely steep part of the cliff where there are no handholds to easily climb, so naturally we climb up the rope. At the top is a flat area with a chair. From there you can climb a little higher on some other levels, but it didn't really go anywhere. From here we are now pretty high up, like 3 or 4 stories, and can clearly see the parked cars from above. This is when a different shitty pickup truck comes peeling down the gravel road from the main road. At first, we don't think anything of it until it stops a little ways in front of our car, and a guy gets out with a rifle. He walks down to our car and starts looking in the windows and surveys the surrounding area, luckily never looking up. At this point, we crouch and just watch. Then another guy in the truck steps out, also with a rifle, and shouts, "Did you find him?" The first guy responds, "I don't see him anywhere. Let's keep looking." He goes back to the truck, gets in, and they drive off up the road. As soon as they were out of sight, we both scaled down the cliff as fast as we could and booked it to the car. We took off and have never been back. Not sure if it was private property or some illegal shit they had going on, but I am completely convinced they were looking for us and would not have hesitated to shoot us. It seems they knew we were there, and part of me is convinced that mean mug lady tipped them off. You hear stories all the time about people getting shot over pot patches in the middle of the woods, and I have seen one pot patch in the woods, but this was fairly close to a main road. Maybe it was private property and we didn't know, but there's definitely better ways to go about it, and county people can be absolutely messed up in the head. My partner and I are avid hikers. Last July, we went on a trip and decided to camp at the spot we love just west of Shenandoah. It's quiet, off the beaten path, and offers absolutely spectacular views of both Shenandoah and portions of George Washington National Forest to the west. The first day and evening of the trip itself were nice and uneventful, though we didn't sleep super well because of the humidity. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike in a portion of Jefferson Forest we'd never been to before. It's comprised of ATV trails and about a dozen campsites, but has a trail that leads off to an old fire tower we'd always wanted to check out. It was about a 45-minute drive from our campsite, mostly on back roads. When we got there, the first thing that stuck out to us was how empty the campsites were. We actually didn't camp there the night before because we'd heard the campsite is usually packed and we knew we wouldn't arrive early enough in the weekend to get a good spot. There were only 2 spots taken. In one was a desiccated tent and a bunch of garbage. It looked like someone had been there for a while, but it was deserted when we arrived. In the other, there was a young woman, I'm guessing in her late teens, setting up a small backpacking tent. There was a truck and one other smaller car in the parking lot. We parked and started getting our gear together, and the woman approached us to ask if we knew where the trailhead was. I told her that we'd read that it branched off about 100 yards into one of the ATV tracks, but we weren't 100% sure which one. Since I was getting such weird vibes from the place, I kinda hoped she'd stick around and go with us to find it, but she just thanked us and took off in the general direction of the trail. We set off and walked up and down a few of the ATV trails until we found the walking path. We saw 2 ATVs shoot by us at one point, but otherwise didn't encounter anyone else, including the woman from earlier. It took us about an hour to get to the top of the mountain where the fire tower was. It's an old metal structure, and you have to climb a narrow set of stairs to get to the top of it. We got up, looked around, took some pictures, and started heading down. Honestly, the view was kind of a letdown. About halfway down, very suddenly, everything stopped. The birds, the bugs, it was dead silent. And I don't know quite how to put this into words, but it felt like the ancientness of the forest was contorting and crushing us. I felt trapped and cornered in spite of the expanse around us. My partner and I looked at each other and wordlessly started to book it out of there. We started running back to the car, but the feeling only followed us. As we were rounding one of the switchbacks, we heard this unearthly shriek, like a cross between metal on metal and a choir screaming off key, and we saw something. I just got a glimpse of it before we blacked out. I don't know how to describe it, other than it looked huge despite clearly not taking up much physical space. It moved in writhes and flashes. It didn't have a color. It just felt like evil and emptiness. I probably only perceived it for half a second before my memory just completely gave way. When we came to, we were sitting in the car and 2 hours had passed. Double the length of time it took us to get up there. I don't know if we lost consciousness or just somehow blocked those hours out. I learned later the exact same thing happened to my partner. Both of the cars were next to us in the parking lot, and there were still just 2 tents at the campsite. The woman wasn't in hers, and it looked exactly the same as she'd left it. I think about her all the time and have spent a ton of time trying to figure out if someone went missing around the time of our trip. It took a few months for my partner and I to talk about that day. Some of the stories I've seen posted on the sub have made me feel so much less alone. We still love to go hiking, but honestly haven't been able to in the Appalachian forest since that happened. I'm curious if others have had other experiences like this. So this encounter happened many years ago, and I was very young. It was in 2001 or 2002, and I was 11 or 12 at the time. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I don't know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and myself decided to accompany him one Saturday to scope out the property. From our home, it was a little more than a 3-hour drive, but we all loved riding in the car, so while it was not going to be the most eventful road trip, we went just to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remember being very underwhelmed by the place. No houses anywhere near, and hardly even any signs of life at all apart from a few birds, and the wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque. Still, we parked our car off the road to go explore the woods a little. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting. Not really my cup of tea. As we walked through the woods, it was a very nice day, but still something felt off. Everyone in our group remarked about the eerie feeling, but my dad and uncle seemed to laugh it off. My mom had goosebumps and kept looking over her shoulder, which made me on edge too. She was very insistent that it was weird and she wanted to leave, saying it felt like she was being watched. After a bit of hiking, I noticed that there was a small red building. I've seen bigger storage sheds in the suburbs, but it looked well built. My uncle said there was nothing about it on the listing, so we went to peek inside. The door was open, and inside there were opened cans of food, a ratty blanket on the floor, and it stunk unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. Following this discovery, we all agreed it would be best to get back to the car. If there was some crazy hermit living in the woods, we didn't want to be around to find him. Only issue, we had walked pretty far into the woods and now weren't exactly sure which direction was correct. The eerie feeling really ramped up, and we were all on edge. We ended up trekking about another mile before we finally found the road, but we were further down from where we had parked the car, but at least we could just follow the road now. Walking along the road, we came across a truly unsettling sight. Right in the middle of the asphalt was a dark gray cat on fire. I have no idea why a cat was out in the middle of nowhere or how it came to be killed and set alight. Obviously, this had just happened, but there was no one in sight. Naturally, we ran the rest of the way to the car. There was a huge scratch in the paint all down the side of it from the hood to the trunk. Thankfully, that was the only damage, and my dad was able to start it without any trouble, and we drove away as fast as we possibly could. My heart is sped up just recounting this moment. Definitely one of the scariest of my life. Needless to say, my uncle did not buy the land, and I'll always remember this terrifying encounter, but like anything over time, I sort of pushed it to the back of my mind, and it just became one of those odd moments you occasionally retell at family get-togethers years later. So much that it's almost just a funny story. The reason I'm sharing this is because I was reminded of it last night while binge-watching some episodes of BuzzFeed Unsolved on YouTube, when they shared the story of a family that disappeared in the same area, while also looking at some land for sale. The disappearance of the Jameson family is the name of the mystery in the video if you're interested. The family died in the same area we were searching roughly 7 years after we made our trip there. There are many theories about their deaths, including the allegations of some sort of cult in the area, complete with something about dead cats. Coincidence? Probably, but the whole story gave me chills. So if my family narrowly avoided being killed by some witches or a cult or whatever, or if we just stumbled upon a hermit who didn't want us in his woods, I'll never really know. My family has been hunting for years. It's a tradition with us. This is a story about the second time I went elk hunting. We live in Wyoming, and there are tons of places to hunt elk around here. We were on Battle Mountain, right on the Wyoming-Colorado border. We were hiking down a small ravine. It was a long hike, and we had already hiked a few miles. The point is, we were already a bit worn out. There are mountain lions, bears, wolves, and coyotes in that area. The only two that are dangerous are the first two. The ones that's scarier is the first. I had heard of stories about people being stalked by mountain lions, but never imagined I would be on the receiving end of one of those situations. Anyway, we were hiking when I heard a sound. The sound, I had heard nothing like it before. At first, I thought it was an idiot with a chainsaw or dirt bike. The sound rose in pitch and transformed into a snarl. Right then, my dad, brother, and I froze. There is something about that sound that makes your legs stop moving without you realizing it. It makes the hairs on your neck stand up, and you become hyper-aware. We stood like that for around 30 seconds, but let me tell you, it felt like a lot longer than that. So we all gave each other looks as if to ask, "Am I going crazy? Did you hear that?" Arguably, the scariest part was we never saw him. In the ravine, it echoed like crazy. An unseen fear is the worst one I can think of. Needless to say, we were on edge for the rest of the hike. I never went back there. The area is beautiful and as serene as anything as you could imagine. Watch your back, though. I'm 35 now, and this happened when I was 15, so 20 years ago. Some of the minute details may be a little hazy, but I remember very specifically all the important parts. So here it goes. My cousin, who lived down the street from me and myself, would frequently ride our bikes down our road to a dirt road about a mile away. From there, we would go down some trails in the woods to a hilly area. We used to call them the dips, but there were 3 hills in a row. These trails were mostly used as horse trails, and really no one would ever be on them except for maybe a couple of old people every once in a while. We would dig out little pits and make dirt ramps to use as jumps, or just go up and down the hills as fast as we could and hopefully not die. I don't remember the specific day, but it was in August, a few weeks before school was going to start. My cousin and I were out there goofing off and having fun. We heard the truck coming before we ever saw it. Vehicles were prohibited from using these trails, but I guess that didn't stop this person. We could hear it getting closer. Then we heard the whooping and hollering along with music being blasted. My cousin and I didn't care, and we weren't scared at first. We kept riding our bikes until the truck came tearing down the trail towards us. It came towards us and started going over the hills. We were on the far hill at this time, but the truck came flying over the top and almost landed on my cousin. Naturally, he was pretty pissed and started yelling at the truck. Every curse imaginable came flying out of his mouth, and I'm pretty sure he made up a few. The truck stopped on the far side of the hill. It was a beat-up old truck, a Chevy, I think. It looked like it was an early 90s model. There were 3 people in it, 2 guys and a girl. The driver stared at us and took a long drink from his beer. I wouldn't say they were older than 21. I'm only guessing here because of the beer, but they could have been 18 as far as I knew. Neither my cousin or I had seen them before. It was a pretty small town and we knew almost everyone, so either they were college kids we had never seen before, or they came from another town. The driver kept drinking and the passenger, who was the other guy, leaned out the window and started to yell at us for being stupid enough to be in their way. I was still kind of shell-shocked at what I was seeing and didn't say a word. It was like my brain couldn't comprehend the stupidity being played out here in front of it. Then everything went in slow motion as I looked over at my cousin. He stared the truck down, his arm deliberately extended, then ever so slowly, I saw him raise his middle finger. Oh shit. The truck engine revved. I yelled at my cousin to move his ass, and both of us were up and over the hill in a matter of seconds. At the bottom of the next hill, we cut through an opening in the trees that still had an upward slope, but it was longer and more gradual than trying to get over the next 2 berms. The truck couldn't follow us that way, but went over both hills and caught up to us further down the trail. We would have stayed off the trail, but the trees got thick again later on, so we had to get back on the trail. Fortunately, they didn't try to ram us, but they did pull up next to us and the passengers started to throw empty beer cans at us. They must have been drinking for a while because there were about 9 or 10 empties he threw at us. We were at the dirt road by now, and there was an open field we could cut through, but the truck was on the side we needed to go, and we weren't about to cut in front of it, so we hit our brakes then changed directions. The truck stopped, and the driver got out this time and started to chase us. We got away from him pretty fast, but then he threw a full beer at us, which caught me in the back and knocked me off my bike. It hurt pretty bad, and I sprained my wrist when I fell. Despite that, I was up and running with my bike again. I jumped on it right before he got to us, and was out of his reach pretty quickly. My cousin and I never looked back and got home in record time. We didn't tell our parents. Neither of us really had a good description of them. I thought the passenger was wearing a hat, and my cousin said no one was wearing a hat. I thought the girl was blonde. She had been sitting between the passenger and the driver. Must have been a bench seat. He said the girl had brown hair. Neither of us got a plate number, so there was really nothing to report. We didn't go back there until school started, and we never saw them again. One reason we figured they were college students or something. Anyways, I just want to go on record stating that those guys were dicks, and it scared the hell out of my cousin and I. After reading a few posts on here, I've decided to add one of the creepier, still unexplained events that happened to me and a group of friends within the past 5 years. Thinking back on it, I still get this unnerved, bad feeling that just sort of lingers. Anyways, here it goes. A group of friends and myself rented a place on a lake for just a fun-filled drunken weekend. We were all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be just a big party. For the most part, that's what it was. The Friday night and Saturday morning, we pretty much went all out having a blast on the water and just doing fun, stupid stuff. Well, naturally, when Saturday afternoon rolled around, we were all so dead from going all out, we decided it would be a night of no drinking, maybe a little weed smoking by some of us, and just kind of having a chill evening and night. That's what it was, relaxed. So 9 p.m. comes rolling around, and about 8 of us were inside the house and 5 outside. The house was a 2-story with a 2nd-story deck back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods you could then hit the lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town, mostly just backcountry old-timers that I assumed were leering and irritated because we were a bunch of college-aged kids looking to have a good time. But the town and the lake were large, so it's not like anyone knew where we were staying. Anyways, 3 of my friends were on the upstairs back porch, and my other friend and I were downstairs outside, just talking on this little old table near the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friend and I were just getting lost in conversation, and all of a sudden there was this weird feeling that encompassed us. Like an unnerving physical experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong we both kind of quieted down. And then, out of nowhere, this loud chanting abruptly came from the woods. I have no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake is set up. I'm pretty sure the voices carried up through the forest. It sounded like a cult chanting away, and all the voices were male. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we were frozen for all of about 20 seconds before I could contain myself and darted towards the house with her following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting, but it was almost evil. Like just something so powerfully uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the 2nd story and ran out on the balcony with the other 3 friends, one of them my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and I naturally asked, "Did you guys hear that?" in the most shaky, freaked out voice. They all heard it, and not seconds later the chanting began again. So the 5 of us are out there, peering into the forest, listening to this chanting that would sometimes sound far away, and then sound relatively close. All male voices in the weirdest language, or I don't even know what it was, sounded like a strange extreme church. Then following the chanting, a loud bang like something hit a huge metal object sounded, and then the worst part came. A man wailing, like an extreme pain wailing. All of my hair was up. It was the freakiest experience ever. My brother and I were staring at each other in a mixture of scared excitement and horror. The wailing stopped, and then it was back to the chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it, I wanted to call the cops, because whoever screamed had been in a lot of pain. That, mixed with the weird chanting, just made me immediately think of some terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say it had to be some drunk guys just messing around, singing and being weird, but no way was that coming from some drunk guys. They were perfectly in sync, then the bang, and then the wail of pain, and then all that weird tension and energy just gone. Nope, I didn't call the cops, and I wish I would have. But honestly, the forest was so large, and since the lake house was up looking down at the woods and lake, it could have been anywhere. It definitely wasn't in our close proximity, but it was close enough to hear all of that perfectly. We went in and got some of the others, but by the time they came out, the chanting had stopped. Someone wanted to go explore and find where it had been coming from, but obviously that was a stupid idea. After that, I was ready to go home. I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now, it gives me the worst feeling. Whatever that was, it felt so wrong and evil. I'll never forget that moment. I can only imagine it was some weird cult stuff. Last summer, I was feeling cabin fever bad after the lockdowns, so I started to go hiking and camping a lot. Normally, I'd go with a friend, but this one time I decided spur of the moment to head out, and since no one picked up their phone, I went by myself. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, not too hot and not too cold. Perfect weather for a long all-day hike. There's a national forest about an hour's drive from me, and I hadn't been there much, so I decided to go there for my walk in the woods. Got out there about 9 in the morning and started down some trails with my pack on my back. By lunch, I was good and deep in the woods. Initially, I'd seen a couple of other hikers, but by this time, there was no one else around. The trails had all been pretty easy up until this point. I was now getting near foothills and the trails were less groomed and started to get more steep. After stopping for a quick bite to eat, I came to a fork in the paths. One went up the hills where the woods were really thick. The other looped back around and continued back to where I had started. I wasn't close to done, so I went down the one that started into the hills. Another hour later, and the trail split again. This time, one went up to the summit of a hill, and the other one continued around the middle of the hills. I took the one that circled the hills. The treetops did a good job of blocking out the sun, and the area got dark and musty. At first, it was just the smell of vegetation, but soon something like rotting meat began to fill my nose. I figured it was a dead animal somewhere, and soon I would be past it. It didn't stop and intensified the further I went. The atmosphere became oppressive, and looking back on it, I should have turned around. But of course, hindsight is 20/20, and instead I went on figuring it was my imagination and everything would soon pass. Then I heard this loud banging. It sounded like metal on metal and would happen only every 10 minutes or so. It was rhythmic and would last for 30 seconds or so. Now I was starting to get freaked out a bit. I was way deep into the woods at this point, and there was nothing around that should be making a noise like that. After the sound happened 3 or 4 times, I stopped to look around to try to figure out where the sound was specifically coming from, but the hills bounced the sound around so much that I couldn't pinpoint it. Still, I went on, unable to wrap my head around that something might be wrong out in such a tranquil place. The smell never went away during this whole time either, and finally it became so overwhelming I was forced to turn back and leave. 15 or 20 minutes on my way back out of there, I heard the metallic banging again, this time followed by a high-pitched scream. That was it. That was all I could take, and I ran out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back at the split that led to the loop back to where I started. Even once there, I was speed walking. I didn't even stop to get a drink of water, and when I got back to my car, my mouth felt like a cotton ball. I've been back there one more time, and this time I brought a friend, but I have not been back down that same trail, instead opting to take the other branches. I don't know what was down there or what was happening, but it still fills me with fear. When I was 13, my dad took me out hiking one time. We were not, and I still am not, any kind of outdoors type of person. I'm more of a stay-at-home and watch TV or read kind of person. I think he was trying to give me a childhood memory or something. I don't know. If anything, it only reaffirmed to me that the outdoors was not for me. Anyways, he took me to some state land a couple of hours away. By the time we got there, it was already afternoon. It was hot and I was already sweating. Still, my dad forced me to go trudge through the woods. It might have almost been fun if it weren't for all the insects that were biting me. An hour in and my feet hurt, but that was when my dad got the bright idea to head off trail. He led me through some brushes that scraped and cut me, then down by a small stream where my feet got soaking wet. I don't think he thought about how long it would take to get back either, because we kept going and going until the sun was almost down. That's when it finally dawned on him that we should be getting back. Only problem was, he didn't remember which way we had come. Like I said, my dad wasn't an outdoorsman. He had spent a year or two in the Boy Scouts, but that's about it. So we were out there with no food, very little water, no flashlights, and completely lost. I was hearing owl and bird noises I had never heard before. With the darkness, my anxiety went through the roof. Every twig snap sent shivers down my spine. We didn't find a trail until 10 at night. Even when we did, we didn't know which way was back to the car. It took us a bit, but Dad finally remembered to look at the moon to at least get some sense of direction. He knew we parked at the north entrance, and by 11, we were finally on our way back. Made it to the car by 1 in the morning and didn't get home till 3. I went to bed and didn't wake up till 4 the next day. Probably not the scariest thing for most people, especially those that go regularly out into nature, but for me it was horrifying. To be lost in the woods with a dad that thinks he's Bear Grylls or something. I kept thinking, what if one of us gets hurt, especially out in the dark? We would have died. I wouldn't have been able to find my way out of there to get help. It took a while, but eventually I forgave my dad. I know he was just trying to give me a fun experience. Still, it was very irresponsible of him. I think he felt bad about it, but eventually we would joke about it sometimes, so I guess that's one good thing to come from it. Either way, I don't go for hikes or out into the woods anymore, and I sure won't drag my kid out there either. So this story takes place in southeast Texas, within 100 miles of Houston. I was in college, but had moved back in with my parents for a semester after some roommate drama. My parents live out in the country, miles outside of town with some acreage. The land in the back of the house consists of 4 zones, really. You got the backyard with the nice St. Augustine. The back, which is a section of woods my parents cleared of underbrush and kept fairly maintained. The back, which is a clearing we used to go back to and do bonfires and parties in high school. And then the woods. After high school, my parents kind of gave up on keeping back the brush and weeds from anything except their nice backyard section. So imagine a big backyard fenced by a wall of tall weeds and large trees that goes back a while, and then a field of giant weeds, transitioning into solid dense woods with oak, some pine, yaupon, and briar, and all that. I also had this dog that my parents let me keep outside. They had a big chain-link dog run she lived in since my parents had no perimeter fencing besides some barbed wire at the very back of the property, and this dog was not the type to stay in one spot. In fact, she was aggressive to other dogs, always going after them, acting tough, and I sometimes worried she'd get out and kill the neighbor's chickens. She was about 60 pounds and not a jumpy or scared dog. Since I was in college, I had no curfew or anything and would always come home late at night, early morning after hanging out with friends or studying or whatnot. On this particular night, it was pretty cold out, about 50 degrees, which is cold to me. And even though she had a house and a bed and straw out there, I felt bad for my dog, so I decided to bring her in to sleep in the garage. I should have been more careful because this happened quite a bit, but somehow this dog always got me. She would wait in the back until the gate was unlocked, and I was in the run. Gate closed with unlocked horseshoe latch. Run around me and pop the gate latch with her nose and bolt off. So of course she did this, and my dumbass was left standing in the run in the cold in the middle of the night. I was pissed because I knew I had to go find her and bring her back. The moon was pretty bright and I had seen her fly into the weed wall and disappear, so I followed her in without a light, calling her name. There were some little trails through the weeds that we tried to keep open so we could access the property, but these were less wide than a person can walk, and the weeds were about a head taller than me, so it was dense. Anyway, I'd gone a ways and had passed through the wooded section out into the clearing, solid weeds 5 to 8 feet tall, and I get quiet, listening, trying to hear sounds of where she might be out there, when I hear intermittent rustling out towards the woods, which at this point are just a real tall dark outline at the edge of the weed jungle. The rustling wasn't the sound I expected, since you usually just crash through the woods. In my head, I'm thinking, what the hell is she doing now? Honestly thought she was probably rolling around with some dead skunk and I was going to have to bathe her. Figuring it was my wild-ass dog, I make my way towards the noise, calling out her name again. As I got closer, it became apparent the rustling was not the sound of an animal charging through underbrush, but more like something intentionally shaking the trees. Like if you would grab a yapon branch and shake it, and all the connected trees and vines would shake too. I was close enough now to make out individual branches silhouetted at the top of the tree line, and I could see that whatever was going on was causing the trees to shake all the way up to the top. This was off and decidedly not my dog prancing around. I shut up and froze. I hear in all these stories people talking about how when they notice the wood goes silent. I can't remember if this happened or not, but as soon as I stood there, I clearly heard 2 or 3 loud deep huffs. I guess it kind of sounded like a bull, but with a deeper fluttering to it. Not like the tonal sounds a cow makes, but the deep, heavy exhale when they're defensive, and it seemed to come from around my head height. For some reason, my mind registered that this thing was a lot closer to me than the tree line. I also remember the distinct feeling that this noise was directed at me. I got this terrible feeling in my gut, like whole body fear and panicked. Rational or not, I yelled my dog's name with all fear and urgency. You know how your voice gets higher and louder at the end? And turned and ran as hard as I could. Either my dog heard my tone and got scared, or she was scared of whatever was on that tree line too, because as I crashed through the weeds, she came up on my left from a creek and flew past me like a bullet. When I got to the open garage, she was trying to get in the back door of the house, jumping on it like a crazy animal. I closed the garage, put her in her kennel, and went to bed. I don't know what it was, and at that time I convinced myself it was one of those hogzillas you hear about on the news. I've been around plenty of cattle, and I've never heard one make a noise quite like this. Not saying it couldn't have been, but something just didn't feel right. This was like 10 years ago, but I know for sure I'm still going to think real hard about it if I ever have to go back out there alone at night. I've had this piece of property for a while now. It's a few acres out in the woods where I was planning to put a cabin, but things happen and I've never built anything substantial on it. I do have my camper out there that I go to when I want to relax away from it all. It's 20 miles in the backwoods, and you can only reach it by service roads and some spider trails. You also got to go through some state land to get to it. There's a little creek that runs through it, and I think it's just heaven. I don't go there often, and as I've described it, you can guess I don't have to worry about people finding it either. Or so I thought. I've been out there every weekend over the last 2 months taking a break from some problems I've had in town. What the problems are isn't important, but the first time I was out on that property, I noticed some things were off. I had left some tools there because I was thinking in the spring I could make some of the land into a garden. They were locked up in a shed I had built. The shed was still locked, but the tools were tossed all over the floor. It was perplexing how someone could have gotten into my shed without busting the lock, and why they would have thrown everything around. Nothing was out of place in the camper when I went in there, which made me even more confused, because I thought if anyone was going to steal something, they would have gone in there first. Nothing else happened that weekend, and I left feeling like it had to be some kind of fluke. Maybe an animal rammed my shed or something, even though there was no damage to the outside. The next weekend I went up there and I found the water hose to the camper had been sliced. I had buried the hose from the well pump for the 40 feet it ran to the camper to keep it from freezing, but when I got there, I found that it had been dug out. It was buried 5 feet down, and someone took the time to uncover it and then cut it. I figured it was some vandals that had nothing better to do than to dig up a hose and cut it. Still, it didn't make any sense. The property is so far out into the woods, who would take the time to even look for it? Got that fixed and reburied it, and by that time, I was ready to go in and make a little dinner. As I was sitting down to eat, the generator cut out. Instantly, I knew something was wrong because I had filled the generator earlier that day, and it should have lasted all weekend if only ran at night. It's one of those heavy-duty Cummins diesel generators, very sturdy and only a year old. While walking up to it, I took the time to look around to find any prints, but there were none in the frost that had settled in on the grass. In fact, there were no signs of disturbance at all until I got to the generator. It had been unplugged. No other damage to it, just the camper had been unplugged. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. My imagination was on overdrive, and every little sound I heard echoed in my head, making it sound 10 times louder. The next day, I hiked all over my property to try and find signs of anything that could give me a clue as to who was doing this. I found some odd bits of trash, mostly food wrappers, that at least told me whoever was doing this was human. Nothing else happened, and I left the next day since it was Sunday, but I planned that the next time I went up there, I would bring some trail cams to hopefully catch who was doing this. The next weekend rolled around and I went back again. This time nothing was out of place to my relief. Even though I was hoping it was all over, I placed the trail cams around the property, starting where I found the majority of trash I had discovered last time. I put 2 at ground level and 1 up in some trees to make it harder to get to. That night, I was woken up by noises of something moving around outside the camper. At first, I thought it was wildlife rummaging around, but then I heard someone talking. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was clearly a human voice. I laid there for about 15 minutes trying to think of what I should do. I thought about grabbing my gun and going out, but I wasn't sure how many people were out there. So I silently got up, grabbed my gun, and took a seat on the couch that is right in front of the door. I figured it would be better to wait for them to come in than to go out there and be surrounded. The handle on my door moved and my pulse quickened. They tried the handle a couple more times, but I had locked it. They couldn't get it open, and I guess they walked off. I sat there for the rest of the night, too afraid to go back to bed. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I woke up, the sun was high in the sky. I went to check on the trail cams and found the 2 on the ground level completely destroyed. The 1 in the tree was fine, so I grabbed it and left back to my place in town. Went back home and looked at the footage. You can see 2 people, maybe. It's hard to tell. They're way in the background, but there is movement there. I'm trying to find someone who can hopefully enhance the footage to see if it gives some clues. They're coming from the east side of the property, and to the best of my knowledge, that's more state land there and no private property. I've gone out during the day and secured everything the best I can, took home what I could move by myself, and locked everything else up. It would take some work to move the camper off the property since I have it semi-established with a septic system and skirts all around it. It's insured at least, so if something happens to it, I got that covered. The best I can come up with is that there's some kind of illegal operation out there. Most likely a meth site, judging from where I live. They're trying to scare me off the place because they have a lab out there and are worried I might find it. As soon as I get some evidence, I'll go to the police. Been thinking about calling a conservation officer as well, to see if they'll check the surrounding area. It sucks because that place is my getaway, and now I'm too scared to get away to there. This one time when I was in my teens, I went and stayed at my friend's house. His place was way out in the boondocks, surrounded by a forest. It was a great big house, not quite a mansion, but still a really big place. They had a tennis and basketball court in their backyard. His dad did something with computers, and this was way back in the early 90s, during the internet boom, and I think he was in on that somehow. Anyways, I went out there after school to spend the night. During the day, we were playing basketball, and then later in the afternoon, he asked if I wanted to go for a walk in the woods. He said there was something back there he wanted to show me. I said sure, and we grabbed some water and then went out to find what he wanted to show me. We walked back there for a good hour or so, and at one point, I thought we were lost, because there weren't any trails or anything like that. We were going through brush and over rock outcroppings. Really, we were all over the place. How he knew where to find what he was looking for was beyond me. Eventually, we got to where he wanted to go, and there I saw a huge pile of animal bones all stacked up in one spot. We were in a depression between 2 boulders with a ridge that made a small cliff in between the 2 of them. If it had a roof, it would have been a cave. Honestly, I was kind of spooked. I'd never seen so many dead creatures in one spot before. There must have been 5 or 6 animals there. A couple of deer were clear to see. The other ones were smaller and without their skin on them at the time. I couldn't figure out what they were. He said that when he first found the spot, he had been hiking back there by himself, and there had only been one set of deer bones. He had been back a few times, and each time there were more animals, and they all had been stacked like that when he found them. He also said that one time there was a skull on a stick at the opening to the depression, but it scared him, so he knocked it down, and it hadn't been put back up since. We spent at least another half an hour walking around the outside of that place and behind it, trying to play detective and figure out what had done that. But then the sun started getting real low, and we figured we should leave. It was dusk when we were halfway back, and in the trees it was getting real dark. This was before cell phones, so neither of us had a flashlight, and we were tripping over tree roots and whatnot. Then we heard a loud howl, which made me jump out of my skin. Him and I both started to run as fast as we could without running into the trees. It was a pretty thick forest. He started to yell at me to hurry up because he could hear something running in the woods. Of course, our imagination was on full blast at this point, and once he said that, I could hear something too. Now here's something I know I didn't make up because it was so real. Once we could see his house, I stopped and looked behind us. I know I saw two red eyes staring at us from inside the dark woods. After I saw that, I ran as fast as I could, and even though he was ahead of me, I beat him inside the house. To this day, I don't know what stacked those bones out there, or what he heard, and to who those eyes I saw belonged to. I would almost think it was a mountain lion kill zone, but then he said one of the skulls had been on a stick, so unless he made that part up, I have no idea what was doing that back in those woods. We never did go back there again to look at the bones. I spent the night at his house a few times after that, but from then on we stuck to his yard, and as far as I know, he never went back there as well. A couple of years ago, I was visiting my uncle on the Oregon coast. I just got laid off and needed a break before deciding to get a new job. My uncle lives on some lakefront property down a gravel road in the woods a couple miles away from the coast. I relaxed and hung out with him for a couple of days just to de-stress and think about things. One day, I decided I wanted to go shooting. I asked my uncle if there were any better spots to go shooting than on the property, and he told me there were a couple of logging trails off the coast highway. These logging trails would go back for miles. You could even travel across part of the state using them if you know which ones to take. I decided to check them out, but first I went into town to get gas for my rig. While I was filling up at the station, I noticed a cool car. I'm always on the lookout for different cars because I'm an enthusiast, and this car just stood out to me. This car will be important later, and for those wondering, it was a Datsun. I don't know what kind, but it looked built for rally racing. The people in the car left first, and I left a minute after them. I headed down the coastal highway and found the road my uncle mentioned. I turn right and take the road. I'm just adventuring and taking many different logging roads that branch out. I wanted to get far away from people, so I wouldn't cause a disturbance or get interrupted by anyone. I drive the various roads for about 10 miles as the crow flies, deep into the woods. I finally found a spot. It was a little path out in the middle of the woods with a hill I could shoot against. I park my SUV and take my rifle out of the case. I grab my targets and some extra ammo. I lock up my SUV and head down the path. As I'm looking for a spot to set up, I hear something whistle. I noticed that all of the wildlife had gotten quiet except for that person or thing whistling. I pause and look where the whistling was coming from. I was coming from the top of the hill I was going to shoot at. I decided to whistle back at the person or thing whistling, and it copied me. I would whistle a pattern, and it would whistle it back. We went back and forth for a while until it whistled a different pattern back to me. I should also mention that the last whistle was slower than the rest, and I heard it moving. I know some people might say it was a bird, but it sounded big, and I could hear the air leaving its mouth as it whistled. I was kind of freaked out at this point, so I slapped the bolt release on my rifle to load a round into the chamber. However, I didn't take the safety off. I decided to grab my stuff and walk back to my SUV. I set my rifle on the floor next to me in my car and drive off. As I'm leaving, I see the Datsun I had seen earlier at the gas station. I was relieved, thinking, thank goodness there's someone else out here. I pull up by them because they were stopped and notice the guy on the passenger side is wrestling with something on the ground. I had my window down, so I said hi. The guy in the driver's seat is just staring at me. He didn't respond. The guy on the passenger side didn't even look at me. He was busy messing with whatever it was he was messing with on the ground. He appeared to be struggling. I looked back at the guy in the driver's seat who isn't blinking. He's just staring at me. I said, "Have a good day," and he mutters something and is shaking a bit. He was acting like he was on drugs. I drive off and find a new place to shoot. I try to put a lot of distance between me and them. I shoot for an hour and decide I want to leave. I clean up my targets and load up in my SUV. As I'm leaving the spot, I see the same Datsun coming towards me. I waved at them and they didn't wave back. I thought it was odd. Did I see something I wasn't supposed to see? Was the thing whistling a person they were meeting up with? Or are the two events completely unrelated? I don't know and probably will never know. Just two odd events that happened together. So my sister called my family the other day and told my parents about a strange man that she and her friend had came across. They'd been out there for about a week and were out walking in the Redwoods when a man appeared out of practically nowhere and startled them. My sister claimed that he looked completely normal and was even kind of handsome, in her opinion, but he gave off a creepy vibe pretty quickly. He apparently began asking them weird questions like who they were and what they were doing out in his woods. After they explained that they were just out exploring, he quickly got annoyed and said they were liars. My sister and her friend began to walk away quickly as they assumed he was probably on drugs, but he walked after them and said more weird stuff. She says he even asked them to kiss each other because he knew they were lesbian lovers. They're not lesbians, by the way. My sister and friend apparently turned around and screamed at him to leave them alone. My sister said this is where he got scary as hell. She says he gave my sister and her friend the most evil and hateful look she's ever seen in her life, and he said this in response: "You two are disrespectful bitches. I've killed a few of you over the last few years, and I'd love to add both of you to the count." My sister and her friend didn't even hesitate and both booked it right after he said that. They heard him chasing after them and screaming at them. My sister says that she couldn't make out much of what he said, other than that he would chop them up and a few other threats. They both made it safely out of the woods, and they didn't see him anywhere. They got in their car and sped back to the town they were staying in. They called the police to file a report, and they headed to another area and will be heading home soon. I'm scared and pissed off that some creep did this to them. "6 years ago, I was an avid hiker and backpacker. I would walk trails all over the states, often planning my vacation time to go somewhere that was as far away from people as I could get. Sometimes it would be a national monument or a well-known mountain, but usually it was well off the beaten path on the back 40 of some state land area. I've since stopped going because it got harder and harder to find somewhere people weren't. Most of them were nice enough, but I found I often ran into some real weirdos out there. Though I have had a variety of different experiences, the majority of them aren't what I would call scary, maybe a little unnerving and abnormal, but nothing I couldn't handle. The story I'm about to tell is the only one I do consider being scary. It happened in the Swan Range in Montana by Kalispell. I took the Big Salmon Creek Trail, which is for hikers and horseback riders. It's 20 miles of trail, and there's nothing against going off the trail in this area, so I figured that's what I would do. Started at the Owl Creek trailhead, and made my way for a good few hours, then cut off trail to do some backwoods hiking. The plan was to swing through the east and approach Big Salmon Lake from that side. A little after noon, and I was trudging along with no one in sight, which was great because I was worried the area would be full of hikers, since it's a pretty popular place. It was around 2 in the afternoon when I came upon a game trail. Decided to follow that, as long as it didn't take me too far off course, since it was easier than pushing through the tall grass. I should mention this was in the spring, so I wasn't worried about snakes. It was still cool enough that if I came across one, they would have been fairly sluggish. In fact, the temperature was dropping fast, with clouds rolling in from the west. Soon, rain began to pelt down on me, and I hurried back under the trees to stay dry. It started to come down in sheets, and I cursed the weatherman for saying it was going to be a sunny day. I was in the mountains though, and weather there was unpredictable at best. Not even looking where I was going, I ran blindly through the brush and trees trying to find shelter. Entered a wooden thicket and I stopped abruptly. It was like something told me something wasn't right before I even noticed what it was. From the branches of the trees were hung animal bones tied up with sinew. A little further in, and there was a small pit dug with signs of a fire having recently been going. Smoke still curled off the charred sticks that had moments ago been lit. Started to get real creepy vibes from the place, and my nerves were on edge. In all the time I'd been hiking, I never had come across something like that. Right when I thought it couldn't get any weirder, I heard some rustling in the bushes. Looked over to see a man coming towards me. He wasn't running or anything. He was lumbering around in the brush like he was lost. His long hair was caked with mud to the point I wasn't sure what its actual color was. He was skinny, more like lean. He didn't particularly look malnourished, but you could see all his thin, wiry muscles. He was wearing scraps of cloths that barely covered him. Thinking he must have been there for a while, I couldn't imagine how he had survived the winter. I called out to him and asked if he was all right. He gave no response except for some kind of mumbling I couldn't make out. Carefully, I walked toward him, and he must have finally noticed me then, because his head snapped towards my direction, and his ice blue eyes locked onto mine. He wasn't aggressive at first. Actually, he seemed afraid of me. He crouched down, still mumbling, and made himself small. I kept approaching him and asked his name. He then looked at me and started to hit himself in the head with his fists repeatedly. I tried to get closer to stop him before he hurt himself, but he spit at me and then ran into the brush on all fours like an animal. I could hear him moving around back there, but didn't dare go after him. A minute or two passed by, and I heard him scurry around in the brush behind me. When I turned, I caught him coming up on me with a rock in his hand. He stopped in his tracks when I saw him, and he started to dance wildly and posture in threatening ways. I did have my gun on me, but I couldn't bring myself to draw it because I don't think he was actually dangerous, and because I felt more sad for him. He must have felt like I was on his territory, so I began to walk backwards out of the thicket the way I'd come, never taking my eyes off of him. He followed me all the way up to the game trail where he stopped, and started to throw small stones at me that he found laying around. I walked backwards until I couldn't see him anymore, and then turned and beelined it back to my car as fast as I could. I reported the incident to the park rangers. Not sure what happened after that since I never got a call back. That event didn't stop me from hiking. It was more that it's difficult for me to go far enough away to find secluded spaces anymore. Growing old does that to you. I do occasionally go hiking, but I keep it local now, and I don't hike as long. Well, that's the story of the scariest thing to happen to me out in the woods. It sure is a weird one if nothing else. This happened last year in the summer. I'm a 34-year-old female that commonly takes my dogs for walks in the national forest near my house. I do this almost every Saturday afternoon when my husband has his bowling meetup with his friends. My dog is a St. Bernard named Mindy. She's a really big puppy dog that wouldn't hurt anybody. While she is great, she is not a guard dog. There are a lot of trails and switchbacks to take out there, and you could almost go every day for a month and not have the same route. So Mindy and I love to explore every nook and cranny. We were going a way I hadn't gone before. We got to the summit of a small rocky hill that lets us see down into the valley on the other side. The valley stretched out for at least a mile, and my plan was to walk to the summit of the other side, and from there, I would see if I wanted to continue or not. So Mindy and I started to walk down the trail. If you know St. Bernards, you know they are a calm breed of dog. It surprised me when she began to growl at something in the trees. I assumed it must have been a squirrel and kept on walking. Got about halfway down the trail, and there was a ravine there that led off into the woods. Here the woods were so thick you couldn't see into them very far. Now I always stay aware of my surroundings, so I look behind me every once in a while. I've almost been ran over by mountain bikes in the past, so I make it a habit to look back every so often. I had been doing that in this walk and hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. When I got near the ravine part, I looked over my shoulder to check and saw that there was a man now walking behind us. I hadn't checked in maybe 5 minutes, but I know he wasn't there before, and it's a pretty straight shot from where I was up to the top of the hill where we came down, so there wasn't a way he had gotten as close as he had without me knowing if he had been on the trail. He was average height, but what struck me as weird was that he was wearing a jacket. It was the middle of summer. No one wears a jacket this time of year. He also had his hands in his pockets and was looking down the whole time, so I couldn't get a good look at his face. Once he got closer, Mindy began to growl at him. I have never heard Mindy growl like that before. I stopped to calm her down and the guy hurried past me. I know nothing scary really happened, but I had a bad feeling about the whole thing. I think he had been back in the trees the whole time. I can only guess as to what was in his pockets and why he didn't take his hands out. If he was going to drag me into the woods, near the ravine would have been the perfect place. My guess is that he was going to do something, but when Mindy growled at him, he got scared and kept walking. I turned around right after that and made my way home, slightly shaken. I haven't gone down that path since, and I probably never will. I get shivers when I think of what might have happened if I had been by myself. Back where I used to live in Arkansas, there wasn't much to do outside of school for teenagers, so my friends and I would cruise the back roads and byways. We were on one such back road we had never been down before. It cut through a densely forested area that we decided to get out and explore. We jumped over the barbed wire fence, which should have given us cause to not go any further, but we were dumb kids and it didn't look like the place belonged to anybody. There was no driveway anywhere and no houses for miles. No posted signs against trespassing, and we figured it was something to do with wildlife control or something. We walked back there a few miles laughing and joking. We weren't trying to be quiet and sneaky at all. It was about an hour when we came upon an old trash dump. There were rusted out washing machines from the 1920s, fenders from old cars, half of a speedboat for some reason, and other old metal things. It looked like a junkyard, honestly. We checked it out for a while until the sun was going down, and then we made our way back to the car. Somehow we didn't go back the same way we had came. We knew the general direction, but we must have veered off of our original path a bit, because about halfway back to the road, we came across some old gravestones. At first we thought it was kind of like the junkyard, just a place people had dumped some old grave markers. That was until we found one that was relatively new and had obviously been dug up within the last year or so, we guessed. There was still a mound and signs of earth having been disturbed. This freaked us all out because who puts a graveyard in the middle of the woods? There were no markers or fencing around the area like a regular gravesite, and no road leading to it. One thing we did notice when we first saw the headstones was that there were only 3 different last names on them despite there being about 10 different markers. We all began to get creeped out and ran as fast as we could back to the car. Finding a graveyard in the middle of the woods with no one around is pretty creepy. When we got back to the road, we were about 100 yards up from the car. No one said a word the whole ride back until we were safe at my friend's house. And then we all were speculating on who would have put that there. I assumed it was an old family burial plot, but one of my friends said it was a dumping yard for a serial killer. Seeing as how the oldest stone there had the date of 1915, I doubted that, but he said it was a group of them or someone who passed down the trade, so to speak. I don't see that as being anything other than teenagers' wild imagination, though, and think my idea is the most plausible. That was 15 years ago, and we never did go back or look into it any further. I'm a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A couple days ago, a student of mine and good friend who I'd taken out into the woods before told me his dad had just gotten 150 acres of land in a secluded, mountainous part of my state. It had a large amount of forest on it that hadn't been explored yet, as his dad was only building something for his horses that took up about 100 yards of the property, and his horses were free to roam at the moment. He said his dad had gotten an insanely good deal on the property, My friend is now a dad of 3, and I know he doesn't get out into the woods that often, so I agreed to go with him because it seemed really fun, and I can imagine he needs a getaway every now and then. We are both indigenous, into cars, into wilderness survival, and all sorts of stuff, so we never ran out of anything to talk about in the woods. His dad, however, told us that he didn't want anybody exploring the woods unless we had a gun. He said it was because he saw coyotes. Now, as I said, we're all indigenous here. We were raised in the same state. Coyotes don't actually attack people, really. My friend, who we'll call RC, also told me a while back when he was first at the property, he saw movement in the tree lines that was roughly human size and shape, but couldn't really tell since his eyesight isn't that good. I brought my AR and a small flint knapping kit, just for the fun of it, and we set off onto the property. We explored a lot of the rolling fields, creeks, multiple natural springs, and ponds. Everything felt normal. It was a beautiful landscape. Eventually, we decided to get to the forested part of the property, as it hadn't been explored yet. As soon as we entered the tree line, the entire mood shifted. The forest had an ambience of its own, very similar to the woods in the movie The Ritual. The woods were gray and dead silent save for the occasional creaking of a tall, tired cedar tree. There was a very small stream running through the center of it with sand that was black. It felt like we were surrounded, watched from all sides. It didn't take long before a very putrid stench hit our nostrils. It was the odor of rotting flesh. We decided to follow the smell and found the remains of 3 to 4 cows. We examined the exposed skulls and couldn't find any bullet holes. It didn't appear to me that these cows had been put down. Something had killed them though, and their bones were spread over about 30 yards. There were large indentations in the dirt all around them that were very vague in their shape. We decided to press on in the woods. Now we were accompanied only by silence, the putrid odor of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats. We kept stopping at the stream as I noticed several different types of tracks, large coyote tracks, and something else that was large but intentionally avoided the sand, it seemed. We pressed on into the woods until we started to find trees that had been bent over and pinned behind other trees while they were still alive, something that could never ever happen naturally. We hiked on and found what I can only describe as a tool made of bone lying on the ground. It was extremely crude, but looked like some kind of scooping tool or knife. It was disturbing because although it looked primitive, it looked way more primitive than a person would make, but an intentionally shaped tool nonetheless. We hiked on until we found a clearing with a pond that had more large oval tracks surrounding it. On the other side of the pond, we found a very strange little tree structure. It was an A-frame. It had rocks placed up against it. However, it wasn't that sturdy, and the rocks were very peculiarly placed. We found no signs of any campfire around it. We found no camping trash. This isn't exactly a place you could hike to from a house. I photographed and made a video of the little hut thing. It was getting dark, so we decided we should head back. I had a flashlight and my AR, but I didn't want to rely on that in the dark with something that kills cows and makes tools out of their bones somewhere behind us. We made our way out of the forest and back to where the trucks were parked just in time before it got too dark to see. As we were leaving, we saw something on the top of one of the hills that we couldn't identify, but didn't stick around to find out what it was. It's worth mentioning the previous owner began construction of something on the property, abruptly halted construction, and left. Last summer, I went camping back in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. I took my horse Bandit back there to do a couple of days riding and just relax. Everything was great the first day. Birds were chirping, sun was shining, and everything was picturesque. Got about 20 miles deep in the wilderness before we stopped to make camp. Set up my tent and let the horse graze. Then I went about brushing him down for the night. After that, I set up my own dinner. By the time I got to eat, the sun was behind the horizon. Just as I sat down, Bandit started to get a little restless, nodding his head about and pawing at the ground. Naturally, this worried me, because he might be smelling a mountain lion or another animal in the area. I tried to calm him down as best I could and patted him and gave him a treat. That worked long enough for me to finish my meal, But then he started up again. I was thinking of moving campsites because maybe there was something in the area he didn't like, but then I heard the snap of twigs out in the night. By this time, the sun had completely vanished and it was pitch black outside. I grabbed my flashlight and started to scan the area as I went for my saddle gun, grabbed my Marlin 30-30, and kept looking around while also keeping Bandit steady. Nothing happened for a few good minutes. Then Bandit reared and started going out of control. I had to let go of him for fear of being kicked. He didn't run or anything like that, but he sure wasn't happy at whatever was out there. Over his bucking and kicking, I heard something rustling in the woods. I shined my light in the direction of the sound and caught red eyes reflecting back my light. It was too tall to be a wildcat, and it was gone almost as soon as I saw it. I heard it trudge through the woods away from the camp. After a minute or two, Bandit had tired himself out and was calm again. I was left there speechless and a little afraid, not knowing what to do. Even though it was dark, I decided to walk Bandit a few miles back the way we had previously came. I didn't want whatever that thing was to know where our camp was, even though it could probably smell us no matter where we were in the woods. I watched over camp that night as Bandit got some rest, and in the morning we headed out and back home. I was unwilling to spend any more time out there with whoever or whatever those eyes belonged to. I've never seen an animal's eyes reflect red back like that, and it worried me. I've been out there with friends a few times since then, and I usually stay up most of the night. I never told anyone else what I saw that time because they would think I was crazy or making it up. Never seen those eyes again since that night. When I was a kid, I used to live by a big forest. My parents would take me for walks back there, and when I got older, I would go by myself. There wasn't much of that place I hadn't covered by the time I was 16. I was that age when this happened. I was out there with my dog, Bishop, taking him for a walk. He was a mutt, and I don't even know what he was mixed with, but he was a good dog. I would always let him off his leash when we were deep in the woods, since I never saw anyone else walk back there. It was after school, so it must have been around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I was walking around, and I used to do some sketching of the scenery. Bishop was marking trees and chasing birds. We were by a fallen tree pretty far back there when I saw someone walking towards us. I called Bishop to heel so he wouldn't bother the person coming our way. Must have been when the other person first noticed us because they stopped dead in their tracks. They were walking kind of funny, hunched over but with a lope at the same time. Not really a run, but long and kind of bouncy strides. Well, they stopped and stared at me for a while. I gave a nervous wave since I didn't know what else to do. Then the person, who I figured was a man by the sound of their voice, started to yell at me, but not in any language I had ever heard. It was a weird gibberish, and every few words almost sounded like something in English but mispronounced. They started yelling at me and would spit after every sentence. I was a 16-year-old boy being yelled at by a stranger and didn't know what to do, so I apologized that I couldn't understand them and started to walk closer to see what they were talking about. Bishop was indifferent to the person. He wasn't growling or rushing to see them because he always loved meeting new people. He followed me but didn't make any kind of sound. As I'm getting closer, the man gets more upset and yells louder. Next, he starts to run at me, which scared me even more, so I turned to run away. He followed me for a good while, but then gave up and just stood there, and he was yelling and spitting. I ran all the way home and told my parents about what had happened. They had no explanation for it and told me to wait before I went back out there and to be careful. A month later, I went back out to the woods, but not the same place. Never saw that man again. It was a really weird experience, and I sometimes wonder what it was all about. "3 years ago, I was out with my boyfriend driving the dirt roads on the outskirts of our small town. There's a lake way out there that you can get to, but only by these roads. They aren't really well kept, maybe graded once a year if even that, and they're pretty much washboards. Your vehicle needs solid suspension to make it there without breaking an axle. We were about 20 miles down the road, no one around at all. There's hardly anyone that ever goes back there. It's our secret little fishing spot. We saw a Toyota Supra on the side of the road, almost in the trees. The hood is up, hazards are flashing, but no one is around. We figured the person had gone to get help and abandoned the car. Not like someone was going to be able to drive that out of there anyways. Spent the day at the lake and left when it was getting dark. Passed by the spot where the car was broken down and it was still there. My boyfriend slowed down to take the license plate to report the abandoned vehicle to the police so they could check on it. I had my window down because at the time I was a smoker. I heard leaves crunching next to my door, and before I could turn all the way around to look, my door got opened. I screamed when I saw the face of a man and felt him grab my shoulder. My boyfriend got scared and floored it, spitting rocks and getting out of there as fast as we could. I didn't stop shaking the whole way back to his house where we called the police. I'd been wearing a tank top and there were scratches on my shoulder from the guy's fingernails. Whoever that guy was, he was never caught. It took the cops 45 minutes to get to the place we said he was at, and he was long gone by then. I always lock my car door when I drive now. This isn't my story, but my father's that he used to tell me when he was alive and after we had a couple of beers. He used to work as a forest ranger up until he retired in the 70s in Yosemite Park. He said it was good work for the most part and nothing crazy ever happened except for one time. It was October 19th, 1965, and he was stationed at the Hennis Ridge fire lookout. He said he would never forget that day. It was midnight, his partner was asleep on the first floor, and he was on the third floor of the observation deck, walking around and enjoying the night, having a smoke. A flash of light caught his eye way off in the distance. He first thought it was lightning because it was a flash and bright, but there was no thunder that followed it. The night was also cloudless, so then he thought it might have been a meteor entering the atmosphere and burning up. He didn't give much more thought to it until about 5 minutes later, when he saw another flash much closer than the last one. This time, after the flash, he saw lights running through the trees about a mile or two away from the tower. He said they were spiderwebbed all through the forest and were crystal blue in color. He had never seen anything like it before, and they reminded him of electricity running along the ground. He said they were visible for a good 30 seconds before they vanished again. He went and woke up his partner because my dad didn't know what to make of it. They stayed up there for 15 minutes, waiting to see if it would happen again. There were no more flashes, but where the second one landed, a light finally was seen again. This time it was orange. They both thought it was a fire that had started because of the color. The odd thing was, though, it didn't move. It stayed in one place, not spreading like a fire would have. It stayed there for a long time. He isn't sure exactly how long, because time seemed to have stopped. It finally did begin to move, but again not like a fire. More like a person walking, as it left no trail behind it. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it left. He and his partner were dumbfounded, and my dad said he'd go take a look. It wasn't that far from the tower, like I said, maybe a mile, 2 at the most. He took his flashlight and headed in the direction he had seen the light. He searched for a good few hours, but couldn't find a trace of what had made those lights. When he got back to the tower, his partner said he hadn't seen any new lights during the time my dad was gone. It left them both scratching their heads as to what could have caused it. They never reported the sighting because they knew no one would have believed them. My dad said that if his partner hadn't seen the light, he wouldn't have believed it himself. He never believed in aliens or anything like that, and never did figure out what could have caused the anomaly. He said it was the strangest thing he had ever seen. "13 years ago, my uncle took my brother and myself out for a weekend camping trip when my parents were having some marital problems. He rented this cabin out on a lake. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen after spending my whole life in the city, and I had never seen a forest before. There were miles between us and our closest neighbors, and so much woods to explore. All weekend we weren't inside for more than a few hours to sleep. It was the last night there, and we went to bed early, planning on taking a morning hike before packing up and heading out. It was a 2-bedroom cabin. My uncle had one of the rooms to himself, while my brother and I shared another room. Around midnight, my uncle came into our rooms without turning on the lights and woke us both up. We instantly knew something was wrong because he was whispering for us to stay quiet and to keep down. A flashlight panned across the bedroom window, casting specters of shadows along the far wall. We could hear men talking outside, and then a car door shut. My uncle crept to the window and barely poked his head over the sash to get a good look of what was going on out there. He said he could see 2 men, and they looked like they were carrying a third. He said the man being carried wasn't moving. There was no moon out that night, and they went past where he could see, so he came back towards us and told us to get into the closet. We stayed hidden for a good few hours until he came and got us again. We didn't know where the guys had gone to, so we stayed up all night. Once the sun rose, my uncle drove us home and then called the cops. On the ride home, we asked our uncle why he had woken up, and he said he had heard a car trunk slam shut, and that's what got him up. The cops did go and check out the area, and here's what almost makes it funny. They found a rolled-up carpet and a bunch of other trash like a dresser, nightstand, and other large pieces. There was no third body. It was someone illegally dumping their trash. They think it was someone who had previously rented the cabin and knew not many people were out there. The cabin was closer and cheaper than for them to make a dump run. I'm so glad it wasn't something worse, but holy shit, did I almost have a heart attack thinking that some mobsters were outside my window that night, dropping someone in the lake. Okay, background. I live in New Hampshire in the southern suburban area. When I was younger, I lived in a couple places because divorce. I'll start off with my mom's house. There were woods that were behind my mom's house that we owned. We owned a pine-dominated acre, but the whole woods were about 20 acres. You could always see civilization from it, either the suburban house rows or a street on the other side that had no houses on the sides. These woods always felt warm to me, and I loved being in them. It was basically a third parent to me. However, on the other side of the street was another forest, full of 10 to 20-year-old oaks and birches. One day when I was maybe 9 or 10, I was playing in the nice woods, and I explored the whole 20 acres of them, and I decided to check out the other woods on the other side of the street. The road was flanked on both sides by forests, and there was a nursing home down the street. I crossed the street, and the moment I entered this forest, my mind was telling me to get out. I had a sensation of being watched. However, I've always been curious, so I pushed deeper until I came to a circular thinner part of the forest, not a clearing, where there was a pile of trash ahead of me. Not drug paraphernalia, but old food and trashed clothing. Now my inner voice was screaming, get out, get the hell out of here. So I ran back through the woods as fast as I could, until I reached the road. I went back into the nice woods and I felt fine. About 4 or 5 years later, I was kind of bored with the woods behind my house, and wanted to check out the other forest again. I go back, now with a knife and a holster, to explore. I had my hand on my knife the whole time. I had the being watched and get out feelings again. I never found the thin part, but I found shoes, dozens of old rotting shoes. There was also a camping stove, an old propane can, food trash, and a camping pot. I picked it up and took it home since I needed a cooking pot for camping. I still have it. The part that actually scared me, though, were the shoes. All kinds of them. Nice shoes, little shoes, women's running shoes, baby shoes, all at varying ages and states of decay. I was freaked the hell out, but I kept pushing. I got to this 35-degree embankment, which I climbed and found a residential area above it. There was a thick fence with no gate, and the other houses had no gate either. The trash and shoes were too deep in the forest to be thrown in by uncaring homeowners. I finally decided to leave. I was super scared by the time I got out of the forest, and I was, and still am, a very emotionally stoic person. However, the worst experience I have had yet was at my dad's house. Well, this was more of his neighborhood. It was a very tightly packed neighborhood, and it was surrounded by thin forests. Small forests of huge pines separated houses. It was in a city, but every now and then I would see a moose or deer. So one day I was walking my dog during dusk. It was almost total night, and the street lamps were on. I got close to a turn in my walking path, with this pine and oak forest, and I thought I spotted something in the forest and froze from terror. My gut wrenched in the most horrible, despicable feeling ever. I felt like I was just told the worst news of my life. It looked like a deer standing up, not a wendigo. It had a fat white belly and brown fur on its back. It was staring right at me. I originally saw its belly, but then when I looked up at its face, I couldn't make out its face. I have good eyesight and should have been able to see it, but it was like my central vision had suddenly been switched to peripheral. It just blended in with the forest. I could see the body and not the head. Then it fell to the ground, got on all fours, turned and ran in the direction of a fence. On the other side of the fence is a dump. The forest it was in is only about 50 feet by 50 feet. It must have jumped about the 6-foot chain-link fence to get in and out. My dog, a hound who is normally smelling the pizza car 30 seconds before it arrives, noticed nothing. I could hear it run away, and the dog perked up and looked at it as it ran off. I immediately turned around. January 2017. I went snowshoeing with a friend out in the back country. It was crisp, to say the least, but it gets you out of the house in the winter months up north. We had driven an hour out of town to a wilderness area I knew that was great for this sort of thing. Soft rolling hills, wide meadows, and a sprinkling of trees to break up the scenery. Got there around 11 in the morning, strapped up and headed on our way. Nothing unusual happened out there. It was a fun time. So fun, in fact, that we didn't get back to the car until it was dark, around 6 in the evening. On the windy roads back, we saw another car with its hazards on. Being dark and cold, we decided to stop to see if they needed help. I got out and knocked on the car's driver's side door, while my friend, also a female, stayed in her car. The car was running, so I figured someone was in there. The windows were tinted, and I couldn't see in with it being dark outside as well. 2 minutes went by, and I thought I'd go look through the windshield to see if I could see anything. When I went to move to the front, the driver's side window finally rolled down. There was a scruffy-looking guy, probably late 40s, looked really rough. I asked what the problem was and if he needed help. He mumbled a few things I couldn't make out, so I asked him to repeat what he said. He was saying it again, and I couldn't still understand him, but when he was halfway through talking, I heard my friend scream from her car, and before I could turn to look, she was speeding up next to me, almost running me over. I was able to see a guy running towards me as my friend threw open the passenger door for me to get in. Unsure of what was going on, I jumped into the car and we sped off. I looked back to see the other man and the guy in the car yelling at each other. I'm surprised my friend didn't swerve off the road with how fast she was going. I guess a good set of snow tires helps a lot. My friend later told me, after she had caught her breath, that while the guy was talking to me, another man came out of the woods and tried to get into the back seat. She had been playing with the lock switch and fortunately had left them on lock while she was waiting for me. When she heard the door being tried, she saw the guy, freaked out, and then almost took off without me until she almost hit me and remembered to tell me to get in. Who knows? Maybe it was all an odd coincidence. The other guy could have been with the one in the car and had left to take a leak or something, and then came back without thinking and tried to get into what he thought was the right car, or it could have been something much worse. We'll never know, and I'm glad of that because better safe than sorry. I go cross-country skiing regularly in the winter. I love being outdoors, and I think winter is the best time of the year. The evergreens with their snow caps and the mountains covered in fog just does something for my soul. Last year I went out as I always do. I've never had any kind of problems out there, but I still take a knife and gun just in case. You'd think winter would be a safer time to go out without bears or snakes, but mountain lions are very active that time of year, and from what I've heard, more prone to go after anything they can since prey can become more scarce. Anyways, I went to a new area with a friend that he had told me about. It was an hour-and-a-half drive out there, and we arrived at about 9 in the morning. I usually make it a whole day thing and bring food and water with me. I parked at the trailhead and we headed out. For a while, we stayed on the trail, but the best part of cross-country skiing is going off-trail. So off we went, exploring everything we wanted to, while making sure we were in visual contact with each other the whole time. 4 hours in, and we take a break for lunch. As we were sitting there waiting for our meals to warm up in their pouch, we heard a large crash come from deeper in the woods. It startled both of us, and neither had to ask the other if they heard it. The crash didn't sound like snowfall or a tree toppling over. It was clear, sudden, and sharp. Not metallic, but almost like a boom. Might have thought it was dynamite, but it still wasn't like that. It wasn't as deep. We sat there for a moment, seeing if it would happen again. Nothing did, so we shrugged it off, ate our meals, and then went on with our hike. We would have avoided the direction the crash came from, but out in the woods with snow all around us, it was hard to tell exactly which direction it had come from. Half an hour after lunch, and we smelled the distinct, acrid smell coming through the crisp winter air. It really burned the nose and had a heavy chemical scent to it. If that was connected to the sound we had heard earlier, we couldn't figure out how. Soon it became nauseating, so much so we had to turn around and start back. On the way back, we could hear at least 2 people yelling, and then another loud crash or boom. I have no clue what was happening out in the woods on that winter day. My friend and I didn't dare go and investigate, mainly because of the caustic smell. We would have gotten sick before we reached whoever was out there. We did call the police as soon as we got cell service again and gave them the location we had turned around at. So yeah, that was a weird adventure, and I hope whatever was going on out there, the people involved were safe.